Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today will be Chris Rossini, who's the editor of the RonPaulLibertyReport.com. And once again, he will bring up the subject of some myths that exist out there and see if we can sort that all out. Chris, welcome to the program today.
Dr. Paul, it's great to be with you as always.
Well, good. I guess it's not too hard for you to look around in the media and find out so many things that the politicians and the pundits do and say that are based on just fallacies, if not only fallacies, myths, and sometimes outright lies that are either out of ignorance or out of purpose. So what do you have today to suggest we talk about?
Well, we'll get started with Bernie Sanders, which is a hot topic. He's very popular with his constituency and fans. And he's an interesting character because oftentimes he'll diagnose a problem correctly. It's just his prescriptions are way off and kind of scary. So I have a couple of quotes from him that you can address. And he starts by saying, "I don't believe it is a terribly radical idea to say that someone who works 40 hours a week should not be living in poverty." Now, that's a good diagnosis. However, he wants to make a terrible law even worse by raising the minimum wage up to $15 an hour. And I have another quote from him, which is another scary one. He says, "I will fight for 12 weeks of paid family leave and medical leave." So please address these, Dr.
Well, I know Bernie pretty well, and we worked together many times in the Congress, and it was usually on the subject of corporate benefits and corporate welfare. And of course, we could agree. It was interesting because, his diagnosis of the corporations getting benefits and how the Federal Reserve System works. So we would attack welfareism for the big corporations. And then when he starts talking about, the poor, I agree with a lot of that too. There is a lot of poor people out there. And I imagine he truly has sympathy for these people and want to help them. But where the real fallacy is, where the myth is, that comes from the left and somebody especially who declares himself a socialist, is they base all their answers on the fact that government has authority and they have wisdom and they can correct problems. But instead of saying that they want to correct the problems by eliminating all the mistakes of government, they don't look at that. Governments, from their viewpoint, can't make mistakes. It's only the rich people in the marketplace who are always taking advantage of the poor that make the mistakes. So therefore, you have to have government to take control, restrain people, and redistribute the wealth through force. I think the one thing that they never pay any attention to, and I don't know whether they probably think of this differently, but they shouldn't. But everything they support is supported through violence, the violence of government. They probably believe in the non-aggression principle for individuals, that you shouldn't rob and kill each other, but they never hold back. Matter of fact, they're pretty enthusiastic about government. But they would never concede the fact that if they use the IRS and guns or the Federal Reserve to dilute the money supply as something that's being vicious and mean and nasty. But they don't see this as force. They see this as a proper use of government. But they complain a lot about individuals, the way they act in the free market. But what do? They take some individuals who wheel and deal and use influence and all kinds of things to get in office. Then they fully trust the people, in government. So he doesn't believe in less government. He just believes in changing management, where a libertarian believes that individuals can take care of themselves so much better. So whether it's a minimum wage law or whatever they propose is all based on government violence. And there's no proven evidence that it's any benefits. The liberal and the socialist believe that they can regulate the economy. they're a little less likely to regulate personal behavior in a social way, but they want to regulate everything in a personal way on economic policies. For instance, the minimum wage. That's a contract. So what they're doing is they're coming in with the force of government and denying the right of an individual to be employed. So if an individual comes in to somebody's office and say, I want to work for you, I have no skills and I'll work for $6 an hour, and the businessman and the individual agree, well, no, there's a prohibition. And they don't see this at all. And there's so much evidence to show that government intervention is a failure. And they refuse to look at history and say that where has been the greatest prosperity? We've never had a perfectly free society. Some societies are freer than others. But the freer society, the wealthier the society, the larger the middle class. And yet they're totally blind to this, and they want to totally depend on government force and violence and this belief that people in government and the bureaucrats can make no mistakes. I claim that the liberals and those who believe in strong socialism are very violent people because they like guns. They don't want you and I to have a gun, but they do want the government to have guns. So if you aren't obedient to the regulations that are arbitrary and very damaging, and if you don't pay your taxes to support some war or some other program, then they send the IRS with a gun and you end up in jail, and we know what can happen there when that happens. People are sometimes put in prison for life just for talking about income tax, like Aaron Schiff was. He literally was put into a cell and left to die with a death sentence because he talked about the illegality and the authoritarianism based on our income tax. So I think this is a great myth that interventionism and liberalism and socialism can increase prosperity, because the history is loud and clear that the more government intervention you have in economic policy, the more poor you have. But you don't have to say, well, that means they can run roughshod over us. No, the rules are very strict. You can't use violence, you can't steal, you have to live up your contracts, you have to have honest money in a free society, and you don't bail out anybody, and that to me would be a much better system.
It has done its damage. As a matter of fact, we have at this moment tens of millions, up to 90 million I've seen, people unemployed in the United States. And a large factor that has contributed to that is government and its regulations on hiring people. They've made it such a chore to hire somebody. And it's not just the federal government, it's state government, local government. Employers have to think twice before hiring somebody.
Right.
Are they going to sue me? Is it going to be illegal to fire them? So right now the government the Supreme Court more specifically, is looking at forcing companies to offer contraceptive insurance coverage to their employees. And this is another government intervention. And we have Gretchen Borschelt, and she's vice president at the National Women's Law Center. And she says women deserve insurance coverage of birth control no matter where they work or go to school. The Supreme Court must stop these efforts to undermine women's health. Please address that, Dr. Paul.
Well, I think there are a couple important issues here. One, overall, which you alluded to, is where do they get this authority, and why can anybody insist that they need something or want something and they have a right to it, and the Supreme Court should rule in favor of somebody who wants to rob somebody else. So that's the overall principle, the moral principle, and the economic principle. But the case that's coming up before the Supreme Court right now is pursued by Christian right people who say, well, it's a violation of their religious principles to be forced to pay for or to sell contraceptives and be involved, which they're absolutely right. But where I think they're drifting away from a sound argument is the fact that they're narrowing it down to the First Amendment and their religious beliefs. In a way, that's part of it. But I think they actually weaken their case by saying this is religious liberty. Because how do you do it from a religious viewpoint if you have 10 different religions and a lot of varieties of each one of those religions, and say we're going to have to try to satisfy them? The protection has to be much broader than that. It has to be the protection of a voluntary contract. So if an insurance company doesn't want to pay this, pay for abortions, and the taxpayer doesn't want to, why should anybody be forced into it? So it's this mandate. It's the mandate and mentality of Obamacare that is so bad. And at times it violates economic principles, it violates religious principles, but those are secondary to the overall principle that government should never interfere with a voluntary contract. And so often liberals are pretty good and progressives are good at understanding this in a social and a sexual and a religious sense. The government shouldn't be involved in interfering with that activity. But as soon as it comes to economics, they think that the government should. A person who's concerned about liberty and part of the liberty movement understand that all liberty is the same. Social liberty is the same as economic liberty, and they should be allowed to pursue this, but they should never be forced to pay. So the Supreme Court in this case, you know, if they had to rule in the religious view, I can see where they can do it, but I think that's way too narrow. It should be broad. We should be defending ourselves against forced contracts with people and being forced into systems where the government dictates everything, and get rid of this whole idea that people who need something, they need health care, they need birth control pills, and never ask, where does this come from? And of course, the government will give it to them, and never really asking how much force is used to take it from somebody else, and having the government participate in the fraud and deceit that leads to these kind of problems. And of course, what it ends up doing, though, eventually a system like that runs out of money, and then there's a big fight over the remaining wealth that's in the country, and that's what's going on now. These cases are so discouraging because they shouldn't even exist. You know, this whole idea to argue in the Supreme Court, at the Supreme Court, whether or not somebody has to pay somebody else's birth control pills, and also for their abortion. That's an outrage. In a society that is dedicated to liberty, you wouldn't be hearing about cases like this.
That's correct. And in a society dedicated to liberty, we also wouldn't have a Federal Reserve, and that's our next subject. Which is a subject near and dear to your heart and mine as well. We're going to go to resident neocon over at the Washington Post, Jennifer Rubin, and she chimes in on Audit the Fed, which is, she's usually talking about war, but now she has something to say about the Federal Reserve. And she says, audit the Fed is an empty phrase that serves as a dog whistle to the conspiracy-minded right. Now, why would she be talking about the Fed?
That to me doesn't sound like a sound economic argument. It sounds like, if we call somebody else a name, all of a sudden we're going to discredit them. But Rubin is known, and they don't see you qualify. You cheated a little bit. You said she's a neoconservative, accurately, of course. But no, she's called the conservative over there to have the conservative position, because even though the neocons name themselves, they don't like to be called neocons because it stirs up a few ideas, and one of them is the establishment and the control of the Federal Reserve. But it also shows that many people, both right and left, Republican and Democrats, support the Federal Reserve System. Otherwise, we wouldn't have such a struggle. So when somebody like this tries to slip it in and have the credibility of a conservative, and there are other conservatives that are well known in this country who aren't supportive of auditing the Fed. But I think when you hear this, I think it's a little bit encouraging, because there's an ongoing process right now, as we have contributed to in our campaign for liberty and Rand's bill in the Senate, getting ready that maybe we may well get that vote in the Senate, and they're terrified of it. If they ever find out who's controlling the money and who's benefiting, who's getting the bailouts, this would be big news. So they cannot contest what we're saying, how important it is. They know how important it is. This is why they are determined to try to discredit anybody who takes this up, and that is exactly what she's trying to do, and steer the argument away from the economic policy. She doesn't want an audit the Fed. Well, 85% of the American people want audit the Fed, even though they wouldn't agree with us that we ought to just get rid of the Federal Reserve. They haven't provided any real long-term benefits. They've caused all the chaos that we have today And so they don't want that to happen. The establishment, the bankers, big government, the military-industrial complex, all the progressives and all the big government conservatives. I mean, I don't think for a minute that the conservatives and the Democrats in the Congress will be enthusiastic about auditing the Fed. But the people have to put the pressure on there. But the big fallacy here is she is just camouflaging the whole issue, trying to steer it away from it being a sound economic policy and something that's of interest to the middle class and something to curtail the special interest to the rich. So she has to come and try to discredit any of us who would suggest otherwise.
Yes, that is true. And let's finish up with one more quote here, Dr. Paul. This is from another conservative with air quotes, of course. This is Marco Rubio, and this is one on increasing military spending, just what we need, right? So he says he wants to modernize our forces to remain on the cutting edge of the land, sea, air, cyberspace, and outer space domains. How about we go for the whole universe, right, Dr. Paul?
Right.
Think about that.
Well, it's good for jobs. Think how many jobs he's going to create, and then we can send them all to outer space. I'd like to send, like I once said, send all these politicians that promote these ideas to outer space. That's where they belong, because it's crazy. Where's he going to get the money? I mean, the country is broke. We're in the middle of a recession. Half the people are unemployed. Half of the young people live with their parents, and the medical care system is breaking down. I mean, it's so precarious. So he's proposing $1 trillion increase. Of course, he wouldn't agree with that, because what he's saying is he has to restore the original budget. But there were some proposed decreases in the increases. He doesn't even want to do that. No, it really is a net increase in $1 trillion over a period of time. And he represents big banks. He represents the war profiteers, the people in the military-industrial complex. And he represents world government, because we have to take care of the world. Look how many things are going on in the Middle East. The NATO, we're the one that supply the manpower and all the money and all the bombs and stirring up all the troubles and support all the coups. So this is representative of runaway spending. And I think right now that the people are waking up because we're out of money and we're going to have to end it. But Chris, I think maybe that might have to be our last question for the day, but I want to thank you very much for being with us today, and let's keep breaking open these myths that are floating around and all the false pretenses that exist.
My pleasure as always, Dr. Paul.
Well, good. And I want to thank the audience today for tuning into the Liberty Report. And I hope these few comments are helpful in trying to understand how the system in Washington works, because it is based on lies, it's based on fallacies, economic fallacies, it's based on misplaced good intentions, it's based on political power, and a lot of these come together. But I would say that the most important thing for us to gain in an understanding are the economic fallacies that refute the idea that a minimum wage law is going to be helpful. And there's so many arguments against that. All these interventions, they look at the short term, but they never look at the alternative. Who pays for it? Who suffers? Who's on the other end of the deal? And when they realize this, they'll realize that government intervention spending, deficits, printing money, all these things do not help. And we're moving into an era where it becomes very, very clear, and even our prestige around the world will be severely challenged in the near future. That's why answers have to be provided. They have to be found in the cause of liberty, sound money, limited government, and a policy in foreign affairs that would lead us to a world of peace. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.